Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about ritual and putting on ritual and what it means for different covens across the world to be using ritual scripts that look more or less the same but still be doing different things. And as a lead into this conversation, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare. Specifically, I watched Joel Coen's The Tragedy of Macbeth yesterday, the 2021 film, with Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand. It's magnificent. If you haven't seen it, it's my favorite film adaptation of Macbeth. And there is a line in Macbeth that is my favorite line in the entire play, and I'm always fascinated to see how a director chooses to play this line. And it's not "she should have died hereafter," it's not "stars hide your fires," it's not "fair is foul." Like, it's not any of the big ones. It's in Macbeth's castle when he and Lady Macbeth are discussing the plot to kill the king, and he's getting cold feet. And he says to her, "And if we fail?" And she replies, "We fail." And then she goes on. She says, "But screw your courage to the sticking place and we'll not fail." And she persuades him. But just that line, "And if we fail, we fail." I think that the way that line is played says so much about the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and about what the director is trying to do with the two of them. Because it's a very simple line, right? He is worried about the consequences of failure, and she is telling him, yeah, if we fail, we fail, but if you do your shit right, we're not going to fail. But just in "and if we fail, we fail," just in those 6 words, you get so much range and so much variety in the way that people stage this play. I have seen productions of Macbeth where the two of them are very cold and very calculating. And you can tell that there is a kind of affection between them, but it's a very distant, reserved affection. Theirs is a marriage of political convenience. They share in ambition, and they're not in love with each other, right? I have seen productions where he asks, "And if we fail?" And she goes, "We fail," right? It's resigned. We're taking a risk here. We're going big. There is a possibility of failure, but the possibility of success makes it worth accepting that risk. I have also seen productions where he asks, "And if we fail?" and she is dismissive of the concept. "And if we fail, we fail. But screw your courage to the sticking place and we'll not fail." And that's a very different dynamic, right? She is pushing him, she's egging him on, and she's refusing to accept the possibility of failure, as opposed to the way of playing it where she sees that failure is real and is a possibility and is willing to take that risk. My favorite delivery of this line that I ever saw was Daniel Craig and Ruth Negga on Broadway. He asked, "And if we fail?" and she said, "We fail," right? If we fail, we fail, but we do it together. And again, that one line delivery presents a completely different dynamic for the relationship between the two of them, and it says so much about what else is happening in the play. It tells you so much about why these people are doing what they're doing. It sheds a light on how Macbeth reacts when she dies later on in the play. Spoilers, I guess, for a play that at this point is, 400 years old-ish? More? Anyways. But all of these productions are working with the same script. In some places they may cut some lines. There's a scene in Act 4 of Macbeth where the goddess Hecate shows up. I'm aware that that's not how it's pronounced. It's how it's pronounced in Shakespeare because of the way it scans. Don't come for me. But there's a scene in Act 4 where Hecate shows up and berates the witches. That's a scene that is typically cut. I don't think I've ever actually seen a production where they bring Hecate in, and there is some scholarship that suggests that the scene with Hecate is a later interpolation, may have been added by Ben Jonson. There is a school of thought in Shakespeare scholarship that says the Hecate scene is not part of Shakespeare's original play, but that's beside the point. The point that I'm making here is that when people are staging a production of Macbeth, they're working from the same script, but they're making choices with it. Some of those choices are about things that they're going to take out, right? Especially if you're doing a film version, if you have a particular time that you have to kind of trim down to, you may not use the entirety of a script, particularly with a really long play. You may trim things, you may make decisions about costuming, about props. So, in particular, again, coming back to Macbeth, because that appears to be our example of the day, in Macbeth, there are two scenes where Macbeth sees something that everyone else doesn't. There's the scene immediately before the murder of Duncan, where he sees a dagger floating in front of him. And then there is the scene after the murder of Banquo, where Banquo's ghost appears at the feast. There is a decision to be made about whether to show these things on stage or in a film on screen, or whether to have Macbeth sort of speaking to empty air. The original stage directions indicate that probably the dagger was originally not shown and that Macbeth was just hallucinating, and we, the audience, don't see it, but that Banquo's ghost was shown. But as a directorial choice, you can play with that. You can show the dagger. You can not show Banquo. That's a hard one logistically, but you can do it. I've seen it done. These are choices that you can make that affect the overall timbre of the play. And they depend on the story that you are trying to tell, right? This is the thing with Shakespeare, right? Like, there are so many choices that can be made, and what differentiates a good production of Shakespeare from a bad direction of Shakespeare is that in a good production, every single choice is made deliberately, and it is made because of a particular interpretation of the story the director is trying to tell. And broadly speaking, that story is going to be the same, right? We hit the same beats, but there are themes that you may want to bring to the fore. There are things that you may want to explore in more depth, and you can do that by making choices around line delivery, around blocking, costuming, props, lighting. All of these things really affect the way that you experience the story, even if on a very basic narrative level, it is the same story. Right? When someone's delivering a soliloquy, how are you lighting that? Are you bringing them away from everyone else and putting them in the spotlight all by themselves so that we experience the isolation of their thoughts? Are you keeping them in the midst of everyone and seeing sort of the internal reflection as whatever action is happening around them? There are choices. We are now going to bring this over to Wicca, and hopefully, if you've been following this channel for any length of time, you can see where I'm going with this. In Wicca, there are choices to be made. We follow broadly the same ritual script, at least for the frame of things, right? Different covens may have substantively different stuff going on in the middle of the ritual, but there are elements where, as an initiate, you can walk into any Wiccan circle in the world and understand fundamentally what's going on. But how you choose to stage that is going to affect the story that you're telling. Or rather, it's going to be affected by the story that you are choosing to tell. I think the clearest example of this, unfortunately, is one that I can't really share in depth. The clearest example of this is the initiation. There are various choices that you can make for the initiation ritual, where you're doing the same ritual, but there are just choices about exactly how you work from that script, how you produce that script. And those choices, I think, can contribute to meaningfully different experiences based on how you choose to stage that ritual. The same is true for Wiccan ritual more generally. And again, unfortunately, I'm not in a position where I'm able or willing to give examples in public on the internet. I have like 5 examples in mind, but I think there's something really powerful in the idea that we can be working from effectively the same script. We can be doing effectively the same ritual. And at the same time, we can be telling very different stories based on the choices that we make in how we say things, when we say things, right? One thing that you see a lot of variation with in Wiccan ritual, not so much in the initiation, but in Wiccan ritual in general, you see a lot of variation with the order in which things are done. People really like to play with that. And that tells a different story theologically. If you do your invocation before you do magic, that tells a different story about the relationship between gods and magic than if you do your magic before you do your invocation. This is just a very, very simple example. But I recently reread The Elements of Ritual by Deborah Lipp. And for anyone who doesn't know, Deborah Lipp is my initiating high priestess. And I reread The Elements of Ritual. It's an excellent book on Wicca. It is how I was trained to a T, and it's really no longer how I see or how I do Wicca. There's a lot in that book that's just not what my craft looks like anymore, which is a normal thing that happens, right? Like when you leave a coven and you start one on your own, you start doing things your own way. That's part of how the craft develops and evolves. There are certain things that are and will always be effectively the same, but there are other choices that are different. That's normal. But the thing that I really love about the Elements of Ritual, even though a lot of the sort of content of it is no longer really how I do Wicca, is that Deborah presents in that book this idea that when you're doing ritual, you should be conscious and deliberate about it. And every choice that you make about how you place your altar, what you put on your altar, how you establish sacred space, every choice that you make in ritual should be deliberate, should be intentional, and should be a part of the larger narrative that you are trying to build with your ritual. And that's something that I really take to heart. And so even though I now am building a slightly different narrative in my rituals than the ones that we built when I was training with Deborah, that core idea is still there. That every choice you make in ritual is a choice and should be a choice intended to produce a deliberate effect. Just like with Shakespeare, the difference between a good ritual and a bad ritual is that in a good ritual, every choice has been consciously made for a reason, and made because it fits with the overall vision of what the ritual is supposed to be doing. When I talk about the relationship between a high priestess and a high priest in a Wiccan context, an analogy that I often use is that the high priestess is a director and the high priest is a stage manager. The high priestess is the one who has the creative vision, has the idea of what narrative she wants the ritual to be telling. She knows kind of what the overall experience is that she's trying to produce, and she gets to make a lot of creative decisions around what we're going to do in order to produce that effect. The high priest is the stage manager whose job it is to manage all of the logistics. Having heard from her, here's what my vision is. The high priest's job is to understand what that vision is, and then to take the actions necessary to make it possible to execute that vision. So the high priest's job is to take care of all the logistics, take care of, whatever. In the theater analogy, costuming, lighting, props. Obviously, these are all things where you would have other people working as part of a team to coordinate them. But the stage manager is really kind of the one who's checking in with a lot of those things, to make sure that everything is going smoothly so that the overall artistic vision can be executed. Now, different covens operate differently. I've said this before, I'll say it again. That relationship between a high priestess and a high priest is not necessarily universal. Other covens might have other dynamics. But that was really the dynamic in my initiating coven, and it's a dynamic that I really carry forward in my understanding of Wicca. Which takes us back to this idea of ritual and theater and performance. There are choices that have to be made. And genuinely, there are choices that have to be made, right? It's not just that some people are getting creative. It's that when performing ritual, you make choices whether you're aware of it or not. You make choices about where you're going to stand and how you're going to say your lines and who's going to say the lines. And I think there are times where people think that they're not making any choices and they're just following the script as written. And you can be following the script as written, but there are still places where there's kind of a necessary fill in the gaps. Like with Lady Macbeth's line, "We fail." You can follow the script as written, but that doesn't tell you how that line should be delivered. How that line is delivered requires you to have an understanding of who these characters are and what their relationship is and what you want to say about them. And if you don't have that understanding, if you don't make a conscious choice of how she's going to say that line, then it falls flat because you don't know what you're trying to say. And you're just following the script as written, but you haven't put any life into it. And I think really the same thing is true in Wicca. And what makes Wiccan ritual good is when there is a directorial vision behind it. And every choice that's being made in ritual is being made purposefully and with an eye to the overall experience and what the ritual is trying to say. So, I will leave off here. Thank you for listening. I have to go to work. Catch you soon.